planned to sleep just 4 hours that night. At 0600, his patrol was scheduled, routine, uneventful. But what Sergeant Mike Thompson didn't know was that within 18 hours, he would face an impossible choice and make a sacrifice that would save every man in his unit, at the cost of his own life. The forward operating base Shank sat like a fortress in the rugged terrain of Logar Province, Afghanistan. As the sun dipped below the mountains on March 15, 2012, the base hummed with its usual evening routine. Soldiers cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home, and tried to catch whatever rest they could before another day in one of the world's most dangerous regions. 23-year-old Sergeant Mike Thompson from Ohio sat on his bunk, carefully folding a letter he'd just finished writing to his younger sister, Emma. In it, he'd told her about the strange dream he'd been having for 3 nights straight. A dream where he was running toward a bright light, but never quite reaching it. He joked in the letter that maybe it meant he was finally going to get that promotion he'd been hoping for. Mike had no idea that this dream would soon take on a meaning far more profound and terrifying than he could ever imagine. "Hey Thompson, you better get some shut-eye," called out his best friend and fellow Sergeant Danny Rodriguez from across the small quarters they shared. "Tomorrow's patrol is going to be a long one. Intel suggests Taliban activity has been increasing in the northern sector." Mike nodded, glancing at his watch, 22:30 hours. If he slept now, he'd get exactly 4 hours before the 6 o'clock patrol briefing. It wasn't much, but in Afghanistan, you learned to function on whatever rest you could grab. As he lay down on his narrow bunk, Mike's mind wandered to home. Emma would be starting her senior year of high school soon. His parents were probably watching the evening news, hoping not to see any reports from Afghanistan. His girlfriend Sarah had stopped writing letters 3 months ago. The distance and uncertainty had become too much for her. But there was something else nagging at Mike's mind, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. For the past week, their translator and local informant, Ahmad, had been acting strangely. The Afghan man who had worked with their unit for over 2 years seemed nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder, and had twice mentioned wanting to tell them something important, but never followed through. What was Ahmad trying to tell them, and why did Mike have the unsettling feeling that tomorrow's routine patrol would be anything but routine? The shrill sound of the alarm cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 05:30. Mike jolted awake, his heart already racing from a fragmented version of that same recurring dream. This time, however, the bright light he'd been running toward had seemed closer than ever before. In the briefing room, Captain Jennifer Walsh spread out a detailed map of their patrol route. "Gentlemen, today we're conducting a standard reconnaissance mission through villages in the northern sector. Our primary objective is to assess civilian needs and gather intelligence on recent Taliban movements in the area." Mike studied the route carefully. They would be traveling through 3 small villages, the largest being Kari Kel, a community of about 800 people nestled in a valley between 2 ridgelines. It was considered relatively safe. They'd patrolled through it 12 times without incident. "Thompson, you'll be leading the 2nd squad," Captain Walsh continued. "Rodriguez would take point with the 1st squad. We're expecting a routine day, but stay alert. Recent chatter suggests increased insurgent activity in the broader region." As the briefing concluded, Ahmad approached Mike with that same nervous energy he'd displayed all week. The translator's hands were shaking slightly as he lit a cigarette. "Sergeant Thompson," Ahmad said in his accented English, "there is something I must tell you about today's mission." Mike leaned in closer. "What is it, Ahmad?" But before Ahmad could respond, Captain Walsh called out, "Mount up! We leave in 10 minutes!" Ahmad's expression changed instantly. The nervous energy was replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "Later," he whispered urgently, "when we return, I will tell you everything. But please, today, be very careful in Kari Kel." Mike felt a chill run down his spine. "Ahmad, if you know something, you need to tell me now." I cannot. Not here. Too dangerous." Ahmad glanced around nervously. "But promise me, when we reach the village, stay close to your men. Do not separate, even for a moment. What did Ahmad know that he wasn't telling them? And why was he so afraid to speak openly about it? As Mike loaded his gear into the armored vehicle, these questions gnawed at him, mixing with the lingering unease from his recurring dreams. The convoy of 3 mine-resistant ambush-protected MRAP vehicles rolled out of Fobshank precisely at 06 o'clock, carrying 12 soldiers into what they believed would be another routine day. None of them knew that within hours, everything would change forever. The convoy moved steadily through the rugged Afghan landscape, dust clouds trailing behind each vehicle like earthbound shadows. Mike sat in the second MRAP, watching the familiar terrain roll by through the small armored window. The radio crackled occasionally with routine check-ins between the vehicles and base command. All call signs, this is Shank Base, radio check, over. Shank Base, this is Thunder 1-1, Lima Charlie, over. Thunder 1-2, Lima Charlie. Thunder 1-3, good copy. Everything seemed normal, yet Mike couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ahmed sat across from him in the vehicle, and the translator's behavior had become even more erratic. Every few minutes, Ahmed would check his phone, then quickly put it away, his face growing more troubled each time. Specialist Johnson, the youngest member of their squad at just 19 years old, was chatting nervously about his girlfriend back in Texas. She sent me this care package with homemade cookies, but they arrived looking like cookie dust. Still tasted amazing, though. Private First Class Martinez laughed. My mom sent me a package once that had melted chocolate all over everything. Even my letters home were covered in chocolate. I had to explain to my little brother why his letter looked like it went through a chocolate factory explosion. The casual conversation helped ease some of the tension, but Mike noticed that Ahmed wasn't participating in the usual banter. Instead, the translator kept staring out the window with an expression that could only be described as dread. As they approached the first checkpoint before Kari Kel, Ahmed suddenly leaned forward toward Mike. Sergeant, there is something you must understand about today. I'm listening. Ahmed glanced around nervously at the other soldiers, then lowered his voice to barely above a whisper. 3 days ago, my cousin in Kari Kel contacted me. He said strange men came to the village, asking questions about American patrol schedules. They offered money for information. Mike's blood ran cold. Why didn't you report this earlier? Because, Ahmed hesitated, his hands trembling. Because they threatened my family. They know where my wife and children live. They said if I warned the Americans, they would kill everyone I love. The pieces of a terrifying puzzle began falling into place in Mike's mind. The increased Taliban chatter, the timing of today's patrol, Ahmed's strange behavior, it all pointed to one devastating conclusion. Ahmed, are you telling me this patrol is a setup? Before Ahmed could answer, the radio exploded with urgent voices. IED, IED. Thunder 1-1 is hit. Thunder 1-1 is down. The lead vehicle, carrying Rodriguez and his squad, had struck a roadside bomb just 50 meters ahead of them. Through the dust and smoke, Mike could see the twisted wreckage of what had been their lead MRAP. But this was only the beginning of a carefully orchestrated ambush that would test every ounce of courage, loyalty, and sacrifice these soldiers possessed. What Ahmad was about to reveal would change everything Mike thought he knew about their mission, and about the impossible choice he would soon have to make. All call signs, this is Thunder 1-2. Thunder 1-1 is down. We need immediate medical evacuation. Mike shouted into his radio as their driver slammed on the brakes, positioning their vehicle to provide cover for potential survivors in the lead MRAP. The twisted metal hulk that had been Rodriguez's vehicle lay smoking in a crater torn from the road. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, the kind that combat veterans know precedes something far worse than what has already happened. Then the silence shattered. Automatic weapons fire erupted from both sides of the narrow valley road. Muzzle flashes sparked from concealed positions in the rocky outcroppings above them, and the distinctive crack whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades split the air. Contact! Contact! We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions! Mike yelled into his radio while simultaneously directing his squad to defensive positions. Thunder 1-3, what's your status? Thunder 1-3 is mobile but pinned down, came the reply from the rear vehicle. We've got at least 15 to 20 shooters on the eastern ridge and more movement to the west. Mike's training kicked in instantly. Years of preparation compressed into split-second decisions. Johnson, Martinez, establish overwatch on that ridgeline. Suppressive fire on my mark. He turned to Ahmad, who was crouched in the vehicle, tears streaming down his face. Ahmad, I need you to tell me everything, right now. They knew, Ahmad sobbed. They knew the exact time, the exact route. This was planned for weeks. But Sergeant, there is something worse. A rocket-propelled grenade exploded just meters from their position, showering them with debris and momentarily deafening everyone in the vehicle. When Mike's hearing returned, he could hear something that made his blood freeze. Rodriguez's voice, weak but alive, calling for help from the wreckage of the lead vehicle. Danny's alive, Mike shouted to his squad. We need to get to him. But as Mike prepared to lead a rescue attempt, Ahmad grabbed his arm with desperate strength. Sergeant, you don't understand. This ambush, it's not about killing you quickly. They want to capture you alive. There are buyers, people who will pay very much money for American soldiers, especially sergeants who know base security procedures. The tactical situation crystallized in Mike's mind with horrible clarity. This wasn't a typical Taliban ambush designed to inflict maximum casualties and retreat. This was a carefully orchestrated kidnapping operation, with the IED used to disable their lead vehicle and separate the convoy, making individual soldiers easier to capture. From the wreckage ahead, Rodriguez's voice grew weaker. Mike, I can't feel my legs, man. Don't let me die here. Mike faced an impossible decision. Attempt to rescue his best friend and potentially walk into a capture trap, or maintain defensive positions and listen to Danny slowly die 50 meters away. But there was something Ahmad still hadn't told him, something that would make this terrible situation even worse than Mike could imagine.
Cover me, Mike shouted to his squad as he prepared to sprint toward Rodriguez's position. Every instinct, every bond of brotherhood forged in combat, demanded that he attempt to rescue his best friend. But Ahmad's grip tightened on his arm. Sergeant, please, you must listen to me completely before you move. Another volley of gunfire forced everyone back into cover. The Taliban fighters were maintaining steady pressure, but Mike noticed they weren't trying to overrun their positions. They were keeping the Americans pinned down, waiting for something. Talk fast, Ahmad. The men who planned this, they are not Taliban. Ahmad's voice shook with terror. They work for someone much worse. A man called Qari Yusuf. He sells American prisoners to the highest bidder, sometimes to terrorist groups who want to make videos, sometimes to foreign governments who want to extract intelligence, sometimes to private individuals who... Ahmad couldn't finish the sentence. Mike's mind raced. He'd heard whispers about Qari Yusuf during intelligence briefings, a former Taliban commander who had gone rogue and now operated purely for profit, selling weapons, information, and people to whoever paid the most. From the wreckage, Rodriguez's voice called out again, weaker than before. Mike, I think I'm bleeding pretty bad, brother. My vision's getting fuzzy. I'm coming, Danny, Mike yelled back, then turned to Ahmad. How many of them are there? At least 30, maybe more. But Sergeant, there is something else, something that makes this much worse. Ahmad pulled out his phone with a shaking hand. They didn't just plan to capture you today. They have been watching the base for months. They know about the shift changes, the guard rotations, the supply convoys. Ahmad showed Mike a message on his phone, a text in Pashto that he quickly translated. Phase 1 complete. American patrol neutralized. Begin Phase 2 at 1800 hours. Mike's blood turned to ice. What's Phase 2? Tonight, when most of the soldiers are asleep, they plan to attack the base. They have inside information about the guard positions, the ammunition depot locations, even the quarters where officers sleep. Ahmad's tears flowed freely now. My cousin. They forced him to get a job at the base. He has been reporting everything to them for 2 months. The horrible scope of the situation crashed down on Mike like an avalanche. This wasn't just an ambush. It was the first phase of a coordinated attack that would put hundreds of American lives at risk. The Taliban fighters weren't trying to kill them quickly because they needed at least one survivor to return to base and report that the patrol had been wiped out by a simple IED. This would lower the base's alert status and make tonight's attack more likely to succeed. But Rodriguez was dying 50 meters away, and every second of delay decreased his chances of survival. From his position, Mike could see movement in the rocks above them. The Taliban fighters were repositioning, probably preparing to use non-lethal weapons, gas grenades or flashbangs, to incapacitate the Americans for capture. He had minutes, maybe less, to make a choice that would determine not just Rodriguez's fate, but potentially the lives of everyone at FOB Shank. What Mike didn't know was that his decision in the next few minutes would set in motion the events that would, 18 hours from now, require him to make the ultimate sacrifice.
"Johnson! Martinez!"
Mike shouted over the gunfire. "I need you to lay down covering fire on my signal. We're going to extract Rodriguez, but this is going to get messy." Specialist Johnson, his young face streaked with dirt and sweat, nodded grimly. "Roger that, Sergeant. We've got your back." Mike turned to Ahmad one final time. "Is there any way to warn the base without alerting these guys that we know about their plan?" Ahmad thought quickly, then shook his head. "The radio communications? They are probably monitoring. And my cousin, he will report any unusual activity at the base." A rocket-propelled grenade screamed overhead, exploding against the rocky cliff face behind them and raining debris down on their position. Mike realized they had maybe 5 minutes before the Taliban fighters either overran their positions or used incapacitating weapons to capture them alive. "Here's what we're going to do," Mike announced to his squad. "Ahmad, you're going to call your cousin right now. Tell him that the American patrol was completely destroyed, no survivors. Tell him the attack on the base should proceed as planned." Ahmad looked confused. "But Sergeant, trust me, Johnson, Martinez, in exactly 2 minutes I want you to create the biggest diversionary explosion you can manage. Use the grenades, use everything. Make it look like our vehicle just went up in flames." Mike's plan was audacious and terrifying in its simplicity. They would fake their own deaths, convince the Taliban that Phase 1 had been completely successful, then use the cover of the staged explosion to extract Rodriguez and attempt a covert return to base to warn of the impending attack. But as Ahmad dialed his cousin's number, Mike heard something that changed everything: the distant sound of helicopter rotors. "All call signs, this is Dustoff 77, crackled a voice over the radio. "We are inbound to your location for medical evacuation, ETA 3 minutes. The medical evacuation helicopter was flying directly into what was essentially a trap. The Taliban fighters would either shoot it down, or worse, capture the aircrew along with the ground troops. Mike faced a new, impossible decision: warn off the helicopter and let Rodriguez die from his injuries, or allow the helicopter to land and risk the capture of even more American personnel. From the wreckage ahead, Rodriguez's voice had grown so weak it was barely audible. "Mike, tell my mom I love her, okay? And tell her I wasn't scared." Ahmad finished his phone call and looked at Mike with eyes full of anguish. "It is done. I told my cousin the patrol is destroyed, but Sergeant, the helicopter—" "I know." Mike grabbed his radio. "Dustoff 77, this is Thunder 1-2. Be advised, landing zone is extremely hot. We have multiple shooters in concealed positions." "Copy that, Thunder 1-2. We're equipped for hot extractions, coming in fast and low." Mike realized that the next 60 seconds would determine whether Danny Rodriguez lived or died, whether the helicopter crew survived, and whether FOB Shank would have any warning of tonight's coordinated attack. He was about to make a decision that would cascade through the next 18 hours in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter swept in low over the valley, its rotors beating the air with thunderous intensity. The pilots had clearly seen the smoke and wreckage and were coming in hot, ready for a combat extraction under fire. "Now!" Mike shouted. Johnson and Martinez unleashed everything they had: grenades, automatic weapons fire, even a smoke grenade to obscure the Taliban fighters' vision. The diversionary attack created exactly the chaos Mike had hoped for, drawing the enemy's attention away from the helicopter's approach. But as the Black Hawk flared for landing, Mike saw something that made his heart sink. Muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions, all targeting the helicopter. The Taliban weren't just trying to capture the ground troops anymore. They were actively trying to shoot down the medical evacuation aircraft. "Dust off 7-7, you're taking fire from multiple positions," Mike yelled into his radio while simultaneously sprinting toward Rodriguez's position. "Break off! Break off!" "Negative, Thunder 1-2. We're committed to this extraction." Mike reached the wreckage of the lead vehicle just as the helicopter touched down 20 meters away. Rodriguez was conscious, but in terrible shape, both legs clearly broken, possibly internal injuries, and losing blood fast. "Danny, stay with me, brother. We're getting you out of here." Rodriguez grabbed Mike's arm with surprising strength. "Mike, listen to me. Before the IED hit, I saw something. There were wires leading away from the road back toward that ridge. This whole thing, it's bigger than just an ambush." As Mike and Martinez lifted Rodriguez from the wreckage, the helicopter's door gunner opened fire, laying down suppressive fire on the Taliban positions. But Mike could see that the enemy fighters were maneuvering to surround the landing zone. They had maybe 30 seconds before the tactical situation became completely untenable. "Go, go, go!" Mike yelled as they loaded Rodriguez into the helicopter. The wounded sergeant gripped Mike's arm one last time. "Don't let them take you alive, Mike. Promise me." Before Mike could respond, Rodriguez was inside the helicopter, and the aircraft was already lifting off under heavy fire. As it climbed steeply away from the valley, Mike felt a mixture of relief and dread. Danny was safe, but now the Taliban fighters would focus all their attention on capturing the remaining ground troops. And Mike still had to find a way to warn Phoebe Shank about tonight's attack. Ahmad appeared at Mike's side, breathing heavily. "Sergeant, my cousin just sent another message. The attack on the base has been moved up. It will begin at sunset in less than 6 hours." The timeline had just compressed dramatically. Mike looked around at his remaining squad, Johnson, Martinez, and 2 other soldiers from the rear vehicle who had fought their way forward during the extraction. 5 American soldiers against at least 30 Taliban fighters, with no vehicles, limited ammunition, and a 6-hour deadline to prevent a catastrophic attack on their base. But Mike was beginning to formulate a desperate plan, one that would require him to do something that went against every principle of military tactics he'd ever learned. He was going to have to split up his squad and send most of them back to base while he remained behind to ensure the Taliban fighters couldn't follow or communicate their true status to their Confederates inside FOB Shank. What Mike didn't realize was that this decision would set in motion the chain of events that would, in exactly 12 hours, place him in a position where he would have to choose between his own life and the lives of everyone he'd sworn to protect. "Listen up!" Mike gathered his remaining squad around him as gunfire continued to echo off the valley wall. The Taliban fighters had temporarily pulled back after the helicopter extraction, but Mike knew they were regrouping for another assault. "Johnson, Martinez, you 2 are going to take point and get back to base. Travel overland, avoid the roads completely. You need to warn Captain Walsh about tonight's attack." Specialist Johnson, his face pale but determined, shook his head. "Sergeant, we're not leaving you behind." "That's an order, soldier." Mike's voice carried the authority of someone who had made an irreversible decision. "Ahmad and I are going to stay here and create a diversion. We need to make sure these Taliban fighters don't have any opportunity to communicate with their contacts inside the base." Martinez understood immediately. "You're going to make them think we're all still here, pinned down and unable to warn anyone." "Exactly. But there's more." Mike pulled out a detailed map of the region. "Ahmad's cousin isn't the only inside source they have. There's probably a whole network of informants at the base. If we radio ahead with specific details about tonight's attack, word might get back to the attackers and they'll know their operation is compromised." Ahmad nodded grimly. "They will change their plans, attack at a different time, or use different methods. It will be worse." Mike pointed to a position on the map about 2 kilometers from their current location. "There's an old Soviet observation post on that ridge. If Ahmed and I can get there, we can observe the Taliban staging areas and radio back specific intelligence about their numbers, weapons, and exact timing. But more importantly, we can prevent them from receiving any communications from inside the base." The plan was tactically sound, but personally devastating. Mike was essentially volunteering for a suicide mission to ensure that his fellow soldiers could escape and warn the base. Johnson's voice cracked slightly. "Sergeant, what are the odds you and Ahmad can make it back?" Mike met the young soldier's eyes with steady resolve. "That's not the mission, son. The mission is making sure everyone at FOB Shank is still alive tomorrow morning." As if to emphasize the urgency of their situation, a new volley of gunfire erupted from the Taliban positions, this time much closer than before. The enemy fighters were moving to encircle their position. "You need to go now," Mike ordered. "Travel light, travel fast, and don't stop for anything. When you reach the base, tell Captain Walsh that the attack will come from the north side, probably targeting the ammunition depot first." Martinez grabbed Mike's hand in a firm handshake. "It's been an honor, Sergeant. Save the goodbyes for later. We're all going home." But even as Mike said the words, he knew he was lying. The mathematical reality of their situation was stark. 5 soldiers against 30 fighters, with no air support, no vehicle extraction, and a 6-hour deadline. As Johnson and Martinez disappeared into the rocky terrain, heading toward FOB Shank with information that could save hundreds of lives, Mike turned to Ahmad. "You still have time to go with them. This isn't your fight." Ahmad shouldered his rifle with grim determination. "Sergeant, they threatened my family. They forced me to betray my friends. This is exactly my fight." Mike nodded, understanding that some decisions transcend nationality, politics, and even personal safety. They were about choosing what kind of person you wanted to be in the moments that mattered most. Together, Mike and Ahmad began their movement toward the old Soviet observation post, not knowing that they were beginning the final 12 hours of Sergeant Mike Thompson's life. The abandoned Soviet observation post sat like a concrete scar on the ridgeline, a remnant from Afghanistan's previous war with foreign powers. Mike and Ahmad had taken nearly 2 hours to reach it, moving carefully through terrain that could hide Taliban fighters around every boulder and ravine. The sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Mike checked his watch, 14:30 hours, less than 4 hours until the planned attack on FOB Shank. From their elevated position, they could see the Taliban staging area in a village about a kilometer to the north. Mike counted at least 40 fighters, significantly more than their original estimate. Through his binoculars, he could also see something that made his blood run cold: heavy weapons, including what appeared to be mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. "Ahmad, look at this." Mike handed over the binoculars. "That's not a quick raid on the base. That's a full-scale assault." Ahmad studied the scene below, his face growing more troubled by the moment. "Sergeant, I see vehicles too. Pickup trucks with heavy machine guns mounted. They plan to breach the perimeter and fight inside the base." Mike grabbed his radio, knowing that he had to risk communication despite the possibility of interception. "Shank Base, this is Thunder 1-2, urgent traffic." "Thunder 1-2, this is Shank Base. We've been trying to reach you for hours. What's your status?" "Shank Base, listen carefully. You have approximately 40 to 50 insurgents staging for a coordinated attack on your position. They have heavy weapons and vehicle support. Attack time is estimated at sunset." There was a long pause before the radio crackled back to life. "Thunder 1-2, say again. Did you say 40 to 50 insurgents?" "That's affirmative. They have inside intelligence on base security protocols. Recommend you immediately change guard rotations, relocate sensitive equipment, and prepare for assault from the northern perimeter." As Mike finished his transmission, Ahmad grabbed his arm urgently. "Sergeant, look." Below them, the Taliban fighters were moving with sudden purpose. Some were climbing into vehicles, others were shouldering weapons and equipment. The entire staging area was mobilizing. "They heard the radio transmission," Ahmad said grimly. "They know their plan has been compromised." Mike watched as the insurgent force began to scatter in multiple directions. Some vehicles headed toward FOB Shank, others moved toward different positions around the valley. The coordinated attack plan had dissolved into something potentially much more dangerous: multiple unpredictable assault groups operating independently. "Shank Base, this is Thunder 1-2. Be advised, insurgent force is now splitting into multiple elements. You may be facing attacks from several directions simultaneously." "Thunder 1-2, Can you provide more specific intelligence on their movements? Mike was about to respond when he noticed something that changed everything. One group of Taliban fighters wasn't heading toward the base or scattering randomly. They were climbing directly up the ridge toward the Soviet observation post. They had been spotted. Ahmad saw them too. "Sergeant, we have maybe 10 minutes before they reach our position." Mike looked at his radio, then at the advancing Taliban fighters, then at the base of FOB Shank, visible in the distance. He was facing a decision that would define the last hours of his life. He could retreat now, try to evade the Taliban fighters and potentially make it back to base alive, or he could maintain his position and continue providing intelligence updates, knowing that each additional piece of information he radioed back could save lives during tonight's attack, but also knowing that staying meant almost certain death or capture. The answer came to him with crystalline clarity. Some choices weren't really choices at all. "Ahmad, you need to get out of here, now." Mike was methodically checking his ammunition and preparing defensive positions around the concrete observation post. "I'm not leaving you, Sergeant." "This isn't a debate. Those fighters will be here in less than 10 minutes. One of us needs to survive to continue providing intelligence to the base." Mike handed Ahmad a detailed notebook he'd been keeping. "This has everything I've observed about their tactics, their equipment, their numbers. If something happens to me, you need to get this information to Captain Walsh." Ahmad looked at the notebook, then at Mike, his eyes filled with anguish. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way." Mike's voice was calm, almost peaceful. "Look, I've been having this dream for weeks. I keep running toward a bright light but never reaching it. Maybe this is what the dream was trying to tell me." As if to punctuate his words, automatic weapons fire erupted from the slope below them. The Taliban fighters had spotted their position and were beginning their assault on the observation post. Mike keyed his radio one final time. "Shank Base, this is Thunder 1-2. I'm going to maintain this position and provide continuous updates on insurgent movements. Be advised, my position is about to be overrun." "Thunder 1-2, we're sending immediate air support to your location." "Negative, Shank Base. Do not divert any assets from base defense. The attack on your position is the priority." Mike positioned himself behind the concrete wall of the observation post and began returning fire. Through his scope, he could see at least 15 Taliban fighters advancing up the slope, using rocks and dead ground for cover. "Ahmad, go! That's an order!" With tears streaming down his face, Ahmad began moving down the backside of the ridge, carrying the intelligence that could save dozens of American lives. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, Mike settled into the kind of focused calm that comes to some soldiers in their final moments. He wasn't thinking about death or fear or even the pain he knew was coming. He was thinking about Rodriguez, safely evacuated and probably in surgery by now. He was thinking about Johnson and Martinez, hopefully reaching FOB Shank with their warnings. He was thinking about Emma, his little sister, and hoping she would understand that some things were worth dying for. The Taliban fighters were close now, maybe 50 meters from his position. Mike could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their final assault. He keyed his radio one last time. "Shank Base, this is Thunder 1-2. Multiple insurgent elements are moving toward your northern and eastern perimeters. They have mortars and are planning to target your ammunition depot first. Do not let them get close to those buildings." "Thunder 1-2, what's your status?" Mike looked down at the advancing fighters, then at the radio in his hand. In a few minutes, these Taliban fighters would either kill him or capture him. If they captured him alive, they would torture him for information about base defenses, troop movements, and security protocols. Information that could get his fellow soldiers killed. That's when Mike realized what he had to do. The dream he'd been having wasn't about running toward a light he couldn't reach. It was about running toward a choice he would have to make. In exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes, Mike would make that choice, and it would ensure that his fellow soldiers lived to see another sunrise. The Taliban fighters were now close enough that Mike could see their faces. Young men, most of them, probably the same age as Johnson and Martinez. In different circumstances, under different flags, they might have been friends. Mike's radio crackled. "Thunder 1-2, we're showing multiple explosions near your position. What's your status?" The insurgents had begun throwing grenades at the observation post, trying to flush Mike out of his defensive position. Concrete fragments and shrapnel filled the air around him. "Shank Base, I'm still operational. Be advised, I can see vehicle movements heading toward your location from 3 different directions. They're trying to coordinate simultaneous breaches of your perimeter." Mike ducked as another grenade exploded just outside the concrete wall. His left shoulder was bleeding from shrapnel, and his right ear was ringing from the concussions. "Thunder 1-2, you need to get out of there. We can't afford to lose you." Mike almost laughed at the irony. They had already lost him. They just didn't know it yet. Through a gap in the concrete wall, he could see the Taliban fighters preparing for their final assault. They had positioned themselves in a semicircle around the observation post, cutting off any chance of escape. In maybe 2 minutes, they would rush his position from multiple directions simultaneously. But Mike had one last card to play. He pulled out 2 fragmentation grenades and carefully placed them beside him, pulling the pins but holding the spoons in place. If the Taliban fighters wanted to capture him alive, they were going to be disappointed. "Shank Base, this is Thunder 1-2 with final transmission." "Thunder 1-2, go ahead." "Tell Captain Walsh that the main assault will come exactly at sunset. They have inside information about your defensive positions, so rotate everything immediately. Tell Johnson and Martinez they did good. Tell Rodriguez." Mike's voice caught slightly. "Tell Rodriguez that I kept my promise." "Thunder 1-2, what promise?" Mike could hear the Taliban fighters shouting to each other, preparing for their final rush. He had maybe 30 seconds left. "Tell him I wasn't scared." The first Taliban fighter appeared around the corner of the observation post, AK-47 raised and ready. Mike released the spoons on both grenades simultaneously. In the last 4 seconds of his life, Sergeant Mike Thompson thought about Emma, about his parents back in Ohio, about Sarah who had stopped writing letters, though he still remembered the scent of her hair and the way she used to say his name like it meant something more than just sound. He thought about the snow in Shelby, the way it piled up on his street like quiet blankets of peace. He thought about the photo in his locker, the one of him and Danny Rodriguez grinning in the rain, soaked to the bone during their first field training but laughing like idiots because they were alive and 18 and invincible. He thought about the promise he made and how it was about to be kept. As the Taliban fighters surged toward the observation post, Mike released the spoons of both grenades and clenched them against his chest. There was no fear, only light. And then, silence. The explosion ripped through the bunker, sending a shockwave echoing across the ridge like thunder cracking through the soul of the valley. Stone shattered, dust rose, and in that final moment, the enemy was denied their prize. Mike Thompson never surrendered. He never let them take him alive. And with his final act, he denied the enemy their victory, choosing instead a death that would save lives, protect his brothers, and carve his name into the legacy of those who gave everything for something greater than themselves. FOB Shank, 06:03 a.m., March 16, 2012. The base was quiet now. Not the eerie quiet of uncertainty, but the charged stillness that comes after survival. Smoke still curled from distant ridgelines, and spent shell casings littered the northern perimeter. But the base still stood, because Sergeant Mike Thompson had made sure of it. Johnson and Martinez had reached the gate sometime around 22 Huntuak the previous night, collapsing from exhaustion, their voices hoarse from yelling warnings. They had barely finished reporting when the first of the enemy vehicles appeared on the northern ridge. Thanks to Mike's transmissions, Captain Walsh had shifted guard rotations, fortified weak points, and moved personnel from the targeted ammo depot hours earlier. And when the attack came, sudden, brutal, and coordinated, they were ready. The enemy expected chaos. They found a wall. By 02:30, the battle was over. More than 40 insurgents lay dead or captured. Not a single American life was lost inside the base, and yet everyone felt the weight of the name that would not answer roll call. The following week, a ceremony was held in the main courtyard of FOB Shank. Rows of soldiers stood in silence. Rodriguez was there, in a wheelchair, IV line still taped to his arms. Martinez and Johnson flanked him. Ahmad stood beside Captain Walsh, holding the notebook Mike had entrusted to him, now laminated, preserved. A single pair of boots stood on a polished wooden box. A helmet rested on the butt of a rifle, its barrel buried in the sand. The final roll call was read. Sergeant Michael Thompson? Silence. Sergeant Michael Thompson? Silence again. Sergeant Michael Thompson? A single voice finally spoke. Gone but not forgotten. A rifle volley cracked the morning air. A bugle played taps. And in the hearts of every man and woman present, something unshakable took root. Back in Shelby, Ohio, the mayor declared March 16th Sergeant Thompson Day. Schools held moments of silence. The local football team added a black stripe to their uniforms. A mural appeared on the side of the old post office, Mike's silhouette saluting against the Afghan mountains. Emma received her brother's last letter 2 days after the funeral. He had written it the night before that final mission. Emma, if this letter finds you, it means I didn't come back. But don't be sad. I gotta do what mattered. I gotta protect my people. That's more than most people ever get in a lifetime. She read it every night for a year. And every time, she whispered the last line to herself like a prayer. Some lights don't fade. They just pass into the hearts of others. Years later, a new class of soldiers would be shown a training video about leadership under fire. One of the case studies would be titled, Thunder 1-2, The Final Stand. Some would cry, all would listen. And when they reached the final slide, a photo of a young sergeant, mud on his face, fire in his eyes, holding a radio and scanning the horizon, every one of them would understand what it meant to lead, to sacrifice, to echo. Because Sergeant Mike Thompson didn't just save lives. He became the kind of story soldiers tell in whispers, in firelight, in quiet tents before battle. A story that doesn't end in death, but in legacy.